This is an excerpt from an online lecture I gave in 2024 about Palestine between Zionism and colonialism.
Zionism is a response to European anti-Semitism. These slides demonstrate different aspects of that. In the middle here, what you have is a poster
Of a
public demonstration in Britain in 1902, which is questioning the fact that Jewish refugees were coming over to Britain in large numbers. This is a 1905 Act of Parliament called the Alien Act, which was brought in by the government of Arthur Balfour, later Lord Balfour. Balfour was a prime minister before he was a foreign secretary. When he was prime minister, he brought in this act to try and prevent the migration of Jews who were being persecuted, mainly in Eastern Europe and Russia, from coming to Britain and seeking refuge. This is like their stop the boats policy of those days. And then you have these pogroms that were happening in Eastern Europe and in Russia, where Jewish communities were being persecuted. This is an example on the right-hand side of a very famous case in the late 1800s, early 1900s of Alfred Dreyfus, who was a Jewish officer in the French army, convicted of treason and sent to Devil's Island on the basis of very little evidence and tried in secret courts. Later emerged that he was innocent of the charges that he was accused of. But the anti-Semitism that went with that in France was massive and had reverberations across the whole of Europe. This French officer was sentenced for treason on trumped-up charges, and it fed this idea of Jews being the other, the foreigner. So that's the situation of the world in Europe. And as is so often the case, what ends up affecting the rest of the world is actually seen through the lens of what's happened in Europe. In the late 1800s, you have the start of a Zionist movement, and Theodor Herzl was the founder of this, and he had the first Zionist Congress in the late 1800s. His philosophy was to try and establish a Jewish homeland somewhere in the world. He was a secular Jew. He was not a religious Jew. The dominant religious position was that this was anathema to their religion. To actually try and migrate back to Palestine, it was not in line with their religious beliefs. These guys were considered innovators or heretics. From a religious perspective, Herzl, who was a Swiss lawyer, argued that the Jews needed a homeland somewhere they could get protection. And the most favored place for this they had then under Ottoman rule. They wanted big money from Zionist funders to buy land in Palestine and allow Jews to resettle there. And that was given some partial permission about the settlement of Palestine by the Ottomans. But statement of Herzl's here in 1895, we must expropriate gently the private property on the estates assigned to us, and we shall try to spirit the population across the border by procuring employment for it in transit countries while denying it employment in our own country. This idea of getting refugees to settle and be denied residency in their own countries in order to get a settlement in Jewish homeland. And he even argued that this would form part of a wall of defense for Europe in Asia, an outpost of civilization against barbarism. From the very early days, there was this idea by the Zionists that they could convince European powers in particular that actually this was in their interest to have a outpost of civilization in the Middle East for the West. Herzl tried to meet the Ottoman Khalifa, Sultan Abdul Hamid, twice to legitimately buy land, which Abdul Hamid rahmatullahi alayhi refused, saying it was not his land to sell. Weizmann was a later Zionist ruler from Eastern Europe originally and then settled in the UK and lobbied very hard in the UK to see that the Zionist project was adopted, and eventually it was in World War I. Weizmann was the guy who argued that Palestine was a land without a people and the Jewish people didn't have a land. And he was trying to argue with the Ottomans that actually this would be in mutual interest. But he later on went to describe the fact that the Palestinians are the rocks of Judea that have to be cleared on a difficult path. This argument of mutual interest was deceptive. The argument that there was no people there is deceptive because later on he argues that there are Palestinians there and there are obstacles and they have to be cleared. He argued for a colonial interest in this. He said, should Palestine fall within the British sphere of influence, and should Britain encourage a Jewish settlements there as a British dependency, we could have 20 to 30 years' time, 1 million Jews out there, perhaps more, and they would form a very effective guard for the Suez Canal. So he was arguing it in colonial interests. Zionism is not just one color. Herzl, Weizmann, and later on Ben-Gurion were of the idea that they wanted a Jewish homeland. They were offered homelands in places like Africa, Uganda particularly. They were offered homeland in South America. Ben-Gurion was offered a homeland in Korea. But Palestine was their favored place, trying to sell it to the British that this would help them control the Suez Canal and particularly their trade routes to India. They were in favor of a two-state solution. They would have a state which they would call Israel, and then there would be a Palestinian state. By the 1930s, Vladimir Jabotinsky, in particular, argued for what they call revisionist Zionism, that they had this idea that from the river to the sea would be greater Israel project. And this is the argument that became dominant. Jabotinsky, there are many pretty bad quotes from this guy. Zionist colonization can proceed and develop only under the protection of a power that is independent of a native population. So he recognized that Zionist colonization needed a powerful backer and broker that would protect it. And in terms of the Palestinians, he said, every native population in the world resists as long as it has the slightest hope of being able to rid itself of the danger of it being colonized. And that is what the Arabs in Palestine are doing. And they will persist in doing so, i.e. resist, as long as there remains a solitary spark of hope that they will be able to prevent the establishment of the land of Israel. Ben-Gurion was a later leader. This is a quote from him, recognizing that Palestine is not an empty country. And initially he says, on no account must we injure the rights of the inhabitants. Later saying, we don't recognize the right of the Palestinian Arabs to rule the country since Palestine is still underdeveloped. There's a contradiction here and a deception. On the one hand saying, we don't want to injure the interests of the inhabitants. That was in the early days when they were still migrating over from Europe. Later, basically, the Arabs have no right to the Jordan River. There was tension between Jabotinsky and Ben-Gurion later on. There was that tension between them, political and personal. Not all Jewish people believed in Zionism. In fact, in the early days prior to World War II, the majority position of religious Jews was this was a kind of heresy. There are still a small but important number of very vocal Jewish people who oppose the Zionist project and occupation. They were the dominant and majority position until probably World War II and the increased persecution of Jewish people in Europe. The Zionists lobbied Britain, France, and the United States. Ben-Gurion actually went to the United States in the 1940s to try and secure support for the Zionist occupation. And they seized a window of opportunity in World War I, Weizmann that did that. After the war, they did not believe that the West would keep their part in the deal. Some were what you could call gradualists who believed in the two states. That was the Herzl, Weizmann, Ben-Gurion argument. And some were the more radical revisionist Zionists who believed in a one Jewish state dominating from the river to the sea. That was the Jabotinsky argument. The British held a mandate after World War I, controlling Palestine. They had put in proxy rulers into Jordan, or Transjordan, it was called then, and Syria, later to be ruled by client rulers loyal to the French, and same in Lebanon. British had client rulers in Egypt and in Iraq. And through this, the British mandate continued till the 1940s. And in that period, we saw the rise of the Jewish population in the region from about 60 to 80,000 before World War I to about 800,000 by the 1940s. A large proportion of them came from Europe. The British facilitated large numbers to come over from Europe, and a large proportion of them came from other parts of the Arab world where Zionists were creating dissent in the Arab world such that Arab Jews would flee to Palestine thinking they were going to get some kind of refuge. When the British mandate was due to expire in May 1948, the Zionists declared their own state unilaterally, and the US recognized it the same day. The Soviets recognized it the same week, but the United Nations only the following year. The United States and the Soviet Union both wanted to invest some support in this Zionist project to have influence within the Middle East. In that period of the British mandate, we saw the rise of militias and terrorist groups, Zionist terrorist groups. First of all, the Haganah, which was the armed brigade Ben-Gurion led. The wing that was affected by the Jabotinsky revisionist Zionism formed a more extreme group called the Irgun, and a break-off of that indeed formed the Stern Gang, or Lehi. Lehi were responsible for many attacks, most famously the attack on the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, where British troops were stationed. Irgun eventually morphed into what is today's Likud. And Lehi, leaders of Lehi, the Irgun, it had the leader, one of the leaders of Irgun was Menachem Begin, who was later a leader of the Zionist occupation under the Likud party. Lehi, one of their foremost leaders, was Yitzhak Shamir, who was later another leader in the Zionist occupied force. By 1948, the Zionists had organized not just politically, but militarily, where the Palestinians were specifically prevented from doing that by the British, which then allowed the Zionists to launch the Nakba, the eradication of 500 Palestinian villages and its populations, either killing people in huge numbers or sending them into exile. Between 750,000 and 900,000 Palestinian men, women, and children were driven out, and 500 villages were completely wiped out in that period of months, commonly known as the Nakba, the catastrophe. The impact of that goes on today, and the politics of the occupation have definitely changed. The majority opinion across the political spectrum, 80 to 90% of the political spectrum, follows the view of a greater Israel, which occupies from the river to the sea, and the Arabs basically are relocated. That's a majority opinion, even amongst the center-left. There is a minority opinion that believes in the philosophy of a two-state in the political elite in that place. We see this played out in the atrocities committed in Gaza and the genocidal rhetoric coming right from the top. The president of the occupation says that there are no innocent civilians in Gaza, and the population there has been calling for a massacre in Gaza and celebrating that Gaza is going to be a cemetery. And we see the rhetoric from the politicians, whether Herzog, Netanyahu, and others, filtering down to the troops on the ground. It's not just in Gaza. Over the last few years, we've seen increasing incursions and violations. We've seen the destruction of houses in East Jerusalem and the furthering occupation and settlements in the West Bank. This map shows the West Bank. The green areas are the areas which the Palestinians have full control over, even though nominally the West Bank is under the leadership of the Palestinian Authority. But the pink areas show the areas of Israeli military control in the region, which shows you effectively the West Bank is being colonized as well. So what you've seen in the last 4 months is the eradication of Palestinians, either killed or ethnically cleansed, and you've seen a rise in the settlement activity in the West Bank, trying to get more Palestinians to leave and take over their land. The current Zionist vision was represented by Netanyahu at the UN before this crisis broke out in October, whereby he showed a map of what he calls Israel in the new Middle East, which he saw the vision of this Israel, where there's no Palestine on the map, effectively, has independent relations with Egypt, with Sudan, with Saudi Arabia, with the UAE, with Turkey, with all these players in the region which are backing it. This is the Zionist vision that has played out till today. Palestinian people are being occupied, murdered, ethnically cleansed, used for political football, with nobody, not even the rulers in the Muslim world, not the armies that are capable of rescuing them, nobody helping them. They are the victims in this. They are the ones where those people who are capable of liberating them need to go in and rescue them.